Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly profound dialogue that sits right at the intersection of existential debate, statistical probability, and theology. We're going to unpack a completely fascinating conversation between a data-driven skeptic and a devout theologian. We'll be looking at the raw data, the philosophical arguments, and the psychological impacts of what it actually means to believe.
To help us navigate this massive topic, we're going to follow a clear roadmap. First, the geography of belief. Then, the problem of suffering. Third, divine compensation. And finally, the psychology of faith.
Okay, let's jump right into part one, the geography of belief and what we're calling the statistical lottery.
Right out of the gate, there's this absolutely staggering data point brought to the table. Globally, 91% of adults simply adopt and keep the religion they were raised in. 91%. Think about that for a second. For the vast majority of people on the planet, your geography and your family of origin almost entirely dictate your religious worldview for the rest of your life.
And you know what? It gets even more concentrated. The host emphasizes that for folks born into a Hindi or Muslim household, that statistical probability jumps to an overwhelming 99%. I mean, only a tiny 1% end up transitioning out of those specific childhood faiths.
So what does this all mean? Well, it brings us to a massive, really challenging question posed by the host. Is it actually fair that there's essentially a birth lottery determining who ends up believing what? If your geographic starting point heavily dictates your faith, and certain faiths dictate whether you get into heaven or hell, doesn't this kind of invalidate the fairness of divine judgment? It's a huge philosophical hurdle that forces us to ask how much of our own belief system is truly chosen versus just inherited.
Now, the guest admits this is a really tough problem, but he fires back with a fascinating counter-argument, sharing a story about a debate he had with Peter Singer, the famous ethicist and atheist. Singer was arguing that people just blindly stay in the religion they're brought up in. But then the guest asks Singer about his own parents. And as it turns out, Singer's parents were atheists. The guest pointed out that Singer had also remained in the exact system he was brought up in. It's a brilliant observation because it frames atheism not just as an absence of faith, but as its own inherited belief system.
This actually leads to a really great pivot in their conversation. The host identifies his current stance as agnostic, and surprisingly, the guest completely praises this. He points out that the word agnostic comes from the Greek agnosko, which literally just means, I don't know. The guest sees this as a perfectly logical, neutralizing stance that is absolutely essential for genuine learning. Because think about it, if you declare you already know everything, or on the flip side that nothing can possibly be known, you just shut down the exploration entirely.
To kind of anchor this shared commitment to intellectual honesty, the guest drops this incredible quote from the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. Bend over backwards to criticize yourself because you are the easiest person for yourself to deceive. It really hits the nail on the head. Both the host and the guest agree that remaining open and constantly questioning your own worldview is just vital.
Moving on to Section 2, the problem of suffering, or beauty and barbed wire.
This shared honesty brings us face to face with probably the heaviest philosophical hurdle out there for any worldview, the tension between an all-knowing creator and innocent pain. The host presents a really intense challenge regarding determinism, and he uses a grim anecdote about a baby born with a parasite eating its eye from the inside. The host's challenge is this: if God is all-knowing and all-powerful, he knew exactly what that innocent child would suffer before it was even created, yet he allowed it to be born anyway. So, how, the host asks, is creating a doomed, suffering soul an act of love?
Which brings us to Section 3, divine compensation and the theological response.
So, how exactly does theology respond to a challenge that intense? Well, the guest is up front. There are no simplistic answers here. But he breaks down his perspective into a two-step argument. First, he points to the cross of Christ as evidence that God hasn't remained distant from human suffering, but actually stepped in and became part of it. Second, and this is absolutely crucial, he points to the resurrection. He argues that if God has the power to literally raise the dead, then God has the ultimate mechanism to fully compensate that child for their earthly suffering. Without that divine power, the guest argues, that child has absolutely no hope at all.
To flesh this out a bit more, the guest brings in a concept inspired by C.S. Lewis. You see, we're all conditioned to think this current world is the only one that exists. But if there is another world and an ultimately fair and loving God, then an afterlife provides the ultimate divine compensation. The guest suggests that once we see what God does to compensate those who suffered innocently, our earthly questions will finally be resolved.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 4, the psychology of faith, focusing on meaning and belief.
Shifting gears from theology over to psychology, we've got to ask, why do humans even believe in the first place? The host asks a super common question: isn't just living a good, kind life enough? But the guest outlines a sharp tension here. He argues that faith isn't really just about trying to be a good person. Instead, it's fundamentally about recognizing human inadequacy. He suggests that if anyone actually tries to measure themselves against the incredibly strict moral standards of the Sermon on the Mount for just one single week, they'll quickly realize they completely lack the power to live perfectly. Therefore, faith is driven by a deep psychological and spiritual need for divine forgiveness.
And this right here perfectly illustrates the core clash between our two speakers. The host points directly to statistical data showing that if you look at a devout Muslim, a devout Hindu, and a devout Christian, the psychology shows they all get the exact same boost in meaning and peace from their faith. The guest, however, pushes back with his personal theological conviction. He argues that he just doesn't see that profound need for forgiveness met in other systems, and that unique fulfillment is found specifically in his Christian faith.
To back up his view that religions aren't just interchangeable psychological tools, the guest points out something pretty interesting. He explains that while all major faiths definitely share moral baselines, like the Golden Rule, their core historical claims directly contradict each other. For instance, the Jewish view is that Jesus died but didn't rise. The Muslim view is that he didn't die on the cross at all, and the Christian view is that he died and rose again. As the guest points out, logically speaking, these three historical claims literally cannot simultaneously be true.
But the host leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought about how we actually measure truth. He notes that sometimes a friend will use the positive feeling they got when they started believing as concrete proof that their religion is true. But the host compares this to watching a really good fiction movie. We all know fiction movies can make us feel incredibly motivated, peaceful, and even connected to the universe. So the question is this: does a positive psychological feeling prove that a supernatural belief is objectively true, or is that boost in meaning just a deeply human psychological phenomenon? It's a massive question, and one that perfectly wraps up this incredible exploration of data, theology, and the human mind. Take that question with you today and keep exploring.